I'm Tim Martin. Today we're going to look at the Black River, one of Northeast Ohio's major river systems that begins its 30-mile life as small runoff streams and ends as a mighty shipping channel at the port city of Lorain before flowing into vast Lake Erie. This river never got the publicity of its sister, the Cuyahoga, which attracted national attention in 1969 when its oil-coated surface caught fire. But during the past 50 years, while no one watched, she, like the Cuyahoga, became one of the most polluted rivers in the United States. If the Black River could have been a poster child during the 1980s, her poster may have said, "Does anybody care?" as man and his industry polluted this river to the point that fish that could survive there became riddled with cancerous livers and tumors. Why should you care about something you can't see? Well, most of us on the North Coast get our drinking water from Lake Erie or eat fish that have been caught there. A polluted Black River flowing into this vast, fresh body of water could potentially affect our health. The first chapter of our story today begins in 1982, when the United States Environmental Protection Agency conducted a series of tests on the Black River. And when the results came in, alarm bells went off. While everyone connected to the river knew it was ill, few realized just how bad a shape it was in before the 1982 EPA tests. That summer, the EPA had tested the river 6 times at 17 locations. Their findings, released the following year, found the river from the Elyria Wastewater Treatment Plant to the Lorain Harbor was an environmental war zone. Not that the 1982 report was the public's first warning. As early as 1973, the International Joint Commission, a joint U.S. and Canada advisory group, had identified the Black River and 41 other waterways as polluted hotspots. In 1982, Don Shrigardis, now Ohio EPA Director, was working for the U.S. EPA in its Northeast Ohio Regional Office.
When we first went out and looked at this, the river, there was no oxygen in the Black River. There was black goo coming out of U.S. Steel that was clearly visible. They used to have booms across the river in a number of locations to collect the oil that was coming out of their outfalls. So we have there was combined sewer overflows from the city of Elyria that were resulting in untreated sewage going to the Black River.
So anyway, we come out here and get a little reading, and this will become part of the permanent record for the site here. I mean, you know, our monthly data, one of the trends that we track. In this case, it's well within the normal ranges. There's nothing out of the ordinary today.
Although what is normal and acceptable is still being debated. Clearly, the river was in worse shape 10 years ago, says Dave Stroud, an environmental specialist with the Ohio EPA, who has tested the Black River for 14 years.
Our survey of '82, which was a chemical water quality survey as well as the biological survey, where we looked at the bugs and the fish in the river, showed that the river was being impacted for about 3.5 miles downstream from the sewage plant. There was very little life in the river due to high ammonia levels. It was toxic to the ammonia levels were toxic to the organisms that were trying to live in the river. Oxygen levels were low. There were a lot of solids from the sewage plant, you know, a process of the treatment of sewage. A lot of the solids were making it through the plant and getting into the river, smothering the habitat of some of the bugs that need that habitat. So in '82, things were pretty bad. 3.5 miles, maybe a little longer, below the sewage plant. The river was in really sad shape.
No one got too excited that summer about the EPA test until research biologist Paul Baumann released his chilling findings. In independent testing begun in the summer of 1980, Baumann had set up nets in the lower Black River to look at fish life there. These grotesque photographs of bottom-feeding bullhead catfish shattered the public's silence. A cancer rate in these fish liver of 38%, a tumor rate of 60%. But while this unbelievably high cancer rate was beyond the public's comprehension, it was not without a scientific explanation.
And in 1982, John Harshbarger at the Smithsonian Institution, who's probably the world's expert on fish cancers, joined us and flew out. He's a pilot, so he flew out in his own plane, came down, and we randomly sampled over 125 fish to get a better idea of what we might be missing just looking at them and taking the ones that appeared to be bad. And again, that it verified basically what we had seen before, that there was at least a 60% tumor rate in the livers and a 38% cancer rate, and we had between a 12 and 20% external tumor rate, either lip tumors or skin tumors. No, I think the health officials were surprised by the cancer. You can always look back and say people should have known, because polynuclear aromatics, the PAHs which cause this, are coal tar, and they're like cigarette tars. They're caused by incomplete combustion materials. And as early as they were the first chemicals identified as a human carcinogen. And that was back in 1776. Sir Percival Pott, who was an English physician, linked scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps to soot, which is the same material, PAHs. And so people have known for a long time that these materials can cause cancer. But I don't think very many people had a good idea of how much of it was being put into the river. And it's sort of out of sight, out of mind.
It was clear that the cancer-causing culprit was U.S. Steel's Koch facility, which produced the coal tar residue that had settled on the river bottom, and that the bottom-feeding catfish had developed cancer by feeding on the sediment that was laced with phenols, cyanide, and polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. What was not clear is what would be done about it. Only in the past 125 years has man had his way with the Black River. Before then, the forces of nature dictated her future. It was 12,000 years ago that the mighty Wisconsin Glacier carved out this 30-mile-long river as it melted its way back to Canada, creating in its wake a river and a 470-square-mile basin that delivers 100 billion gallons of water a year to Lake Erie. This annual deluge of water proved to be a problem for man because it carried with it an estimated 150,000 cubic tons of chocolate-covered silt. In order for man to use the river for economic gain, it would have to be dredged.
What I think of first, Tim, is when our industry was starting here in Lorain on the Black River, they were building ships, wooden sailing vessels, years and years ago. And to get them from the river out to the lake, they had to do some dredging of sand at the mouth of the river, which would build up after storms.
With man's use of the lower Black River for industrial purposes blocked by the shallow nature of the river and the constant buildup of sand and silt, a decision to dredge its lower 5 miles for economic progress would change her forever.
Mr. Witkins was the mayor of Lorain in 1894 when the steel mill decided to come into Lorain. The steel mill said we would come in if you would do certain things. If you would set up a dock line, if you would dredge so we could get up the river, 4 miles up the river to where they would set the steel mill.
The city did dredge and Johnson Steel did come. Her massive furnaces lit the sky April 1st, 1895. The port city of Lorain was on the move, and the Black River was about to be punished because of it. Over the next 50 years, industry flocked to the deep water port of Lorain, which provided access to cheap water transportation and, on land, abundant labor.
After the steel industry, 1898 came in the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company from Cleveland, and they came into Lorain, bought something like 21 acres right around that area, and that was on the east side of the river, south of our Basco Bridge. And they set up 1 or 2 dry docks to build ships. And they built the first steel boat in Lorain in 1898, I do believe, the Superior City. And she was launched here. The river was dredged, helping the steel mill get started. And they also were able to move this boat then when it was completed out into the lake and working on her excursions of moving ore or coal or wood.
Dwayne and a whole generation of children grew up on the lower Black River. In those days, no one thought much about what the industries that fueled Lorraine's economic growth were doing to the environmental condition of the river.
Well, there were a whole bunch of kids. Some of them were called river rats that we kind of lived on the water. We protected ourselves from any damage. We knew what to do and what not to do. And we just kind of grew up down on the river. After we'd do our minimal chores in the morning, we'd sneak off for the lake or for the river. And we would fool around down to the lake. We'd have bonfires and do our cooking of meals down there with hot dogs and baked potatoes and that kind of thing. Or if we'd hear a tug blow for the bridge, we'd hop on a bicycle and go down to the swinging bridge, get on the bridge when the bridge is being turned, and we're right there to look down on the top of the vessel.
Much has been written over the past years about the natural beauty of the Black River, particularly as it snakes its way through rocky channels in the city of Elyria, where the river breaks into two branches, the West Branch and the East Branch. But you have to get close to the river to fully appreciate its spectacular beauty. You'll go away resolved to preserve this river for the next generation to come. While the 1982 EPA report was damning, the Black River's condition didn't become dinner conversation until the release of 3 years of testing by Ohio State researcher Paul Baumann on bottom-feeding catfish. Baumann's study, revealing that brown bullhead in the river had developed a high cancer rate, shook this city and prompted the State Department of Health to ban the eating of fish caught there.
The Ohio Department of Health made the decision to issue the warnings on eating of bottom-feeding fish.
Ken Pierce is the Lorain County Health Commissioner. After learning of the cancer-riddled fish, he and state health officials moved immediately to advise the public against putting themselves in danger by eating fish from the Black River or even swimming there.
That was the concern in fish naturally having the ability to bioconcentrate or pick up the toxics and concentrate it within their fish tissues. And of course, if a human would eat those fish, would actually be magnifying it within their body as well. That's why the advisory came out.
Jack Lavria, retired journalist and community volunteer, remembers swimming in the river as a boy. He reflects on the community's shock over the fishing ban.
The feeling was devastating, to say the least. I've lived in this town for 76 years and have been on that river many, many times in my youth, and used to do fishing out there. We used to swim in Black River back in the 20s. And when that news came out, it just was one big shockaroo. That's all I got to say.
I think the community must have had a gut feeling all along that the kind of stuff that was coming out the stacks anyway at the steel plant, they had to know that it was polluting the river.
Well, I think, you know, it's the old story. You look at the river and you see it every day and you take it for granted that it's okay. But you never realize that pollutants are getting into that river, not only from industry, but from other sources. And when the deceased fish turned up, that was really something that came as a big surprise.
Until now, it had been out of sight, out of mind for the public in the polluted Black River. But help was on the way, as others in the community joined Lavria in wondering out loud if industry was out of control, running over top of the environment.
I was a little stunned when the report came out that the fish were not good to eat from the river. It made you kind of wonder what was happening, what the pollution came from. I think it was a buildup not only of industry here in Lorain, but I think it's industry way up the river, backing up the river, south of the county, where farms were dropping residue into the river, where some industries in maybe Elyria or any other communities along the river were emitting solvents or whatever residue into the river. The whole combination. We all got lax, I think. After World War II, we were hurrying to make things for the war. We weren't giving a lot of thought into what we were polluting, and I think it just caught up with us.
The systematic crushing abuse of the Black River by man since the turn of the century had caught up with her. No longer could she re-energize herself. This time, she would need outside help. By 1983, distant guns began to rumble, signaling help was on the way. Some say because they were easy targets, some say because they were the biggest culprits. But that year, the U.S. EPA and the Ohio EPA moved the U.S. Steel coke plant and the Elyria wastewater treatment plants into its legal gun sites and prepared to fire. The agency began enforcing discharge permit limits to meet water quality guidelines. At U.S. Steel, this EPA action had immediate results. The cost to clean up the discharge from its coke plant so it met those standards was too high. The facility would close in October of that year.
Part of the economic decision of shutting or running any facility is you have to look at all of your costs. Obviously, you look at the cost of manufacturing of the product, what the cost is delivered to the next step in the operation, and part of that not only is your operations costs of labor, of your raw materials, but also part of the costs are the environmental costs. And as we saw the way that the government was going at that time, the environmental costs that we were going to have to be forced to spend to keep that coke plant running were far in excess of what we could afford and still maintain a profitable product.
The closing of the coke plant had a dramatic impact on the lower Black River. Researcher Paul Baumann retested the fish in 1987 for cancer and just released his finding.
Tumor level, overall liver tumor level was cut almost in half. It went from 60% down to 31%. And the cancer rate, the actual advanced lesions, cancerous lesions, had declined from 38% down to 9%. So almost only a fourth of what they were in 1982.
Although U.S. Steel, by its own estimates, had spent nearly $30 million on environmental improvements since 1969, the EPA wanted still more. It would battle with the company for most of the decade over the actual dredging of the contaminated PAH sediment that lay on the river's bottom. But by 1988, the company and the government had reached an agreement. U.S. Steel would dredge 50,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment from the river bottom near its number 2 outfall and place it in a protected landfill. The operation was completed in late 1990, but its short-term impact may be to raise the level of cancer in bottom-feeding fish.
See, the dredging was ordered almost 10 years ago when things were still very hot, and the idea at the time was to take out that hot material. But by the time they got around to actually doing it, a lot of the sediments were starting to be sealed over, and the tumor rate and cancer rate were dropping. So now, my guess is that long-term there may be some benefits from that. It's probably a good idea to get it out of there. But short-term, we may see a rise, actually, in the cancer rate, because in doing the dredging, they probably cut into those hotter materials and stirred them up.
Next, the EPA moved to bring the Lorain and Elyria wastewater treatment plants into compliance with their discharge permits. Lorain agreed to build a new west side treatment facility to relieve its overloaded east side plant. But the city of Elyria, whose aging plant was seriously overloaded as well, said it could not afford a new plant and wanted to delay any improvements until 1999. The issue was settled in court. In a consent decree, the city agreed to pay for about 1/2 of the $42 million cost to expand the plant's capacity from 8.5 million gallons a day to 13 million gallons a day and meet Clean Water Act requirements. Since it became operational in late 1988, the results have been dramatic.
Since they finished that project at the sewage plant, the oxygen levels have come back up. We don't see the kind of problems that we did before. And that's good. That's a good sign. All that money that was spent was useful. The oxygen level's right around 10 parts per million, which is really good. Fish and bugs need a minimum of 2 to 3 parts per million to survive. Anything less than that, they'll be stressed pretty heavily and like I say, either avoid the area or possibly die.
The cities have come a long ways towards correcting their abuse of the Black River. Just 50 years ago, in 1928, sewage in Elyria was collected and discharged directly into the river. But according to environmentalists, in spite of the money that has been spent, serious problems remain.
Up above us here in the city of Elyria, there's what are called combined sewers. A portion of the central part of the city is the sanitary sewers and the storm sewers are one. The storm water travels with the sanitary water, and when we get a rain, the sewers get overloaded and overflow into the nearest ditch or stream or whatever. And the Black River gets hit pretty hard after a rain. There's not a whole lot that can be done about that unless the city's going to spend millions of dollars putting in new sewers or things like that. If the problem gets bad enough, that can be ordered or that can be done.
While the federal and state EPAs focused on the most flagrant polluters during the 1980s, the general public sat on the sideline. Their involvement should have come from a process called a RAP, or Remedial Action Plan, which the Ohio EPA was charged with implementing. During the RAP process, the public helps identify all sources of pollution in an area of concern and determines how they'll be cleaned up. RAPs for Ohio's other 3 environmental hotspots had been underway for years. So in 1988, the Ohio EPA tried to jumpstart the RAP process for the Black River and scheduled a public hearing. The bad news for the river was that no one bothered to show up. Since being appointed in May of 1991, Ohio EPA Director Don Shurgardis has been working to try to speed the Black River Remedial Action process, a process that should have begun in 1988.
I think the public sentiment was, well, things are being done. There's either no further problem or the problem is not particularly important to us.
Finally, in the summer of 1990, Mike McIntyre, a reporter for the Plain Dealer, wrote about the public's apathy towards getting involved. He describes the atmosphere at that time.
I found that many people weren't particularly worried about the Black River, it seemed. Some of the people locally were talking about the progress the river has made on its own and how there are so many plans for it in the future, and it didn't seem as though there was an alarmist attitude here. Elsewhere, that attitude was pretty strong. The environmental groups that give reports on the Great Lakes and environmental hotspots around there, all of them were up in arms about the Black River Remedial Action Plan. Locally, it seemed as though it wasn't picking up any steam.
When Lorain County residents read McIntyre's article in August of 1990, indicating there was no organized support for the environment in the county, things began to happen. While most community leaders sat out this round of the Black River cleanup, others saw an opportunity to make a difference. Oberlin College staff members began pushing for the RAP process to get started, and with administrative and financial support from the Nord Family Foundation, these volunteers began conducting their own water test on the upper branches of the Black River. Their goal was to get the RAP to expand their pollution testing to include the entire Black River Basin.
We decided to pick out 2 places, one on the east branch and one on the west branch here, upstream from Elyria. And we wanted to show to the steering committee that we definitely need to define the area of concern larger than from Elyria downstream. It's been tentatively defined from Elyria downstream to include the Inner Harbor area. But I believe, and many other people believe, that there are problems upstream with agriculture runoff and the development that is occurring in the Grafton area and other things. We need to look upstream and include the whole river basin.
Wolf and her students began testing in April of 1991. Preliminary results are disturbing.
We only have the first 6 weeks of results back in, and we're taking a look at that. We definitely have a problem with fecal coliform, which means problems with possibly septic tanks or stock areas, feedlots, things like that. We definitely have high fecal coliform counts, and there may be some other problems.
Although they aren't armed with any testing data, some citizen environmental activists agree with Wolf's findings and scoff at Ohio EPA Director Shrigardis' claim that the river is 90% cleaned up.
No, I don't think so. I can't believe that. What about the other chemicals and stuff? Are they going to check for that? They couldn't check that there, right? They could not check what's in the water. All they could check is oxygen and what, pH level?
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, all the films that we've been shooting, we have found 2 10-inch drains open, pumping raw sewage right into the river, plus another drain that must be bigger than a 10-inch drain because it's coming up in the ground, and it's a big pool about like this, and it runs all the way down into the river, and it's really nasty, smells terrible, and that's right behind the Elyria High School on the west branch of the, the West Black River, and it's bad over there, real bad.
Ironically, although the major polluters identified in the 1980s are now in check, that may have been the easy part. The next step for the EPA and the RAP Committee will be difficult, if not impossible. Identifying pollution that's coming from indirect sources, what specialists call non-point pollution. The prime culprit isn't any one city or any smokestack industry. It's closer to our stomachs than that. It's agriculture. There are 300,000 acres of land in Lorain County. 144,000 acres of that is planted in crops, corn, or beans. In order to maximize productivity, farmers help Mother Nature along with fertilizers, pesticides, and fungicides. How does that in itself contribute to pollution? Well, 3.3 tons of dirt per acre per year is lost to soil erosion. In the Black River Basin, much of that ends up in the river, and it's a serious problem that remains unchallenged by the government and the public.
I would say in terms of a runoff situation here in the county, we probably have a moderate to, I don't want to say bad or severe situation, but it's moderate or a little bit worse in terms of agricultural runoff. And where that comes from is from farmers planting corn, applying nitrogen fertilizer, and because of rains and runoff,